Maybe I can already start by welcoming everybody. I'm really excited to talk today about developing a digital intervention for survivors of intimate partner violence, and to talk about possibilities and challenges of digital interventions, and also to give you some insights into the intervention I do develop within my PhD project. Next slide. So I want to start with why are digital interventions a promising extensions to the face-to-face support services we have. Well, they can be accessed at real time at low cost and with a low threshold character. They can provide support to survivors continuously and privately. And at the same time, so they are highly, at the same time to a lot of people, so they are highly scalable. And we actually have a pretty good proof that they are effective for the treatment of other mental disorders and health issues. And they are tailorable to diverse needs, for example, to the needs of diverse survivors in terms of gender or sexual orientation, cultural background, etc. Next slide. So how do the digital interventions look like that we have at the moment for survivors, which have been developed and research? So most of them are screenings with or without psychoeducational content, meaning you will get the screening maybe on a tablet, and then you will get feedback on your results and maybe get some psychoeducation. Then we have a lot of safety decision aids, which contain, I think, well-established danger assessment, safety planning, priority setting exercises in form of an app. And then we have psychoeducational modules, which are standalone and aim at different targets. And all of them are so-called advocacy-based interventions. And I think this is really interesting. You talked about like combining psychological needs and advocacy-based needs, and this is what I want to get into too. Because on the other hand, we have like exclusively psychological therapies, mainly for people with PTSD or depression. And I think I don't have to mention that all of those have been developed are, to my knowledge, for female victims, unfortunately. Okay, next slide, please. So systematic reviews and meta-analysis found that they are highly acceptable and feasible, but in terms of their effectiveness, they show no superiority of digital interventions compared to different control conditions in reducing intimate partner violence or symptoms of PTSD and depression. So the question is, what could we improve here, right? Next slide, please. And I already said that what we did a meta-analysis on psychosocial interventions for survivors of intimate partner violence, like all kinds of interventions. And what we found is that it's actually so-called integrative interventions, which are effective in supporting survivors. So you really have to target their like legal and safety needs, but also their psychological and social needs. And this is actually in line with what qualitative studies find, what survivors express, what they need from support services. Can't go on all of this, but I find this interesting. So next slide, please. So our goal is to develop a digital intervention which integrates both and provides information on intimate partner violence and its consequences, but also targets like the psychological needs of survivors. And it's not a full trauma therapy though, because it's only online, but it's more about like giving first insights into these information and also into like what might take place in therapy to kind of lower the barrier and maybe take some fear about like what therapy and counseling does it look like. So the goal is really to lower the barrier to access face-to-face services when needed, and not to replace them. Next slide, please. So these are the modules that we came up with so far. And the survivors can actually choose what kinds of modules they want to work on. And they will go to a website, log in, and then they can choose which modules they want to do, work on one at the time, and then they will get also feedback from an e-coach on their like input they're giving within those modules. Next slide, please. So I kind of want to show you what my intervention looks like, but unfortunately it's in German, so I try to explain what you see here. Well, we have a lot of information in psychoeducation in form of text, audios, and videos. Most often participants can choose what they want to, like how they want to get their knowledge, and they can also choose if they want to get more in-depth information on something, on some things. And we always have this summary of key messages you can see in this like yellow box. Next slide. Then we also have case examples recurring throughout the modules. We try to make them diverse and optional. And I have to be honest with you, I started researching intimate partner violence, focusing on female victims. But luckily I broadened my focus, which also brought me here. So there will show up some men in these case examples for sure. Yeah, next slide, please. We have a lot of interactive content and exercises like self-reflection exercises, symptom checks, guided relaxations, and worksheets, and then also homework. Next slide. And then we have a lot of validations and check-ins. So we really ask participants often how they are doing, and we really want to enhance self-care and self-compassion. So if they're saying they are not doing well, we ask them, well, what could you do yourself now to maybe feel a bit better? But we also give them ideas about this, of course. And then we also provide always links to emergency care and support services so that they can be accessed when needed. And we remind them to take breaks if needed. Next slide. So what we did was a study where we took some example modules and we showed them to survivors. All of them were female, unfortunately. Men could take part, but we did not recruit them. Yeah, so I think we have to do this still, maybe after my PhD. Yeah, and we did think aloud studies, meaning that they kind of went through the modules, worked through it, and they just said everything they think of it aloud. And then after it, we did like an interview asking some more in-depth questions about this. Next slide. And I shortly want to present to you some of the key findings. So what we found was in terms of users' needs, that they need the intervention to reduce their feelings of isolation, be anonymous and private. The intervention should be low in complexity, but highly structured. It should give some kind of feel-good atmosphere and validation to the experience, and it should acknowledge like the difference of experiences of intimate partner violence, and also be sensitive to these, meaning that some might only experience psychological violence, and yeah, this should still be acknowledged. And it should be tailorable, meaning that yeah, it should be personalized to the needs that the different survivors have, and it should be tangible and practical. Okay, next slide. In terms of language, it should be clear, direct, and understandable, appreciative, differentiated, and sensitive. I talked about this. And what survivors really appreciated were metaphors and analogies to depict complex concepts. Okay. And in terms of design, again, it should be clear and simply structured. Well, images was not that easy. Some really liked warm and soft colors, while others felt that they are not serious enough. So I think it's really tough to kind of get the right choice here. And they really appreciated multimodality, what I said, like they can choose between videos and text, that they really appreciated. And they liked elective options and branching. In terms of content, they really like questions and tasks that encourage interaction and reflection. They really appreciated solution orientation, practical tips, and also the direct feedback from the coach and the encouragement to take breaks. And some really appreciated the case studies, while others did find them helpful at all, but they just skipped them, so that was fine. Next slide. So what also came up were the disadvantages of digital interventions. In terms of security, survivors did not really worry about like data security, but more about the perpetrator finding out about them using this program. So here it's really important, of course, to be vigilant in terms of security and to provide a lot of information about anonymity and privacy, but also to transparently communicate the limitations and potential danger of using these. Then the lack of personal content and that the intervention could not be profound enough was what we often heard in the interviews. And that's why we really have this focus on like motivate to seek face-to-face support services when needed. But also give guidance and assistance within the intervention. And then there was a bit of distress and difficulties due to misunderstandings and yeah, think here we really have to anticipate and prevent misinterpretations and be really sensitive in what kind of language we use. Thanks. So we also talked about barriers, which were structural barriers, digital literacy, how to reach survivors and identify a survivor. I think especially the last point, we have talked about this quite a bit at this conference. Well, possible solutions should be free of charge. We should ensure that it's highly usable and the language is easy. We need public advertisement for that. And then the last point, how to address survivors. I think that's really tough, and I will get back to this, but I brought this quote, which illustrates it. It says, so I basically think that for people who are actually in the situation, this word violence or anything is just what makes one shy away a little bit, I think. So this participant was worried that people who actually gonna need this will not identify with how we advertise this. And this leads us to the next questions, which is about the target group. So people said that it really depends on which target group we have, what thematic priorities we should set within this intervention, and which wording we use to address the participants. Again, I brought a quote. I have the impression that it wants to cover two things. On one hand, create a bit of awareness, if I might say it like that. You are there, you have a problem there. And at the same time, it also assumes you already know that you have a problem. And here you can get help. And I wondered whether this could not perhaps be separated. Next slide. And I'm really struggling with this because it's so hard to clearly define a target group, because you can't say, are people safe now? Like, you can't tell from their relationship status. You don't know what they need and what they identify as. So maybe the solution is more to do a tailored intervention, which actually is able to adapt to the needs of the participants. And then also to use really sensitive and inclusive language, visuals, and content. And what this means in terms of adapting the intervention to my survivors, I did a bit of research on that, and I want to talk about this quickly. So next slide, please. What I actually find quite promising is that, to me, a lot of those recommendations seem pretty similar to the recommendations that we get when we look at what female survivors need. So maybe it doesn't have to be that different at all. They also say we need public advertisement. We need to use inclusive language and represent different types of masculinity and sexuality. Well, it needs to effectively address the needs, ensure confidentially, and be continuous and inclusive again. So next slide. Then in terms of theoretical basis, I think this is also what was kind of well established in support for female survivors, is using strength-based approaches, mindfulness and CBT techniques, act and value-based work, and then action orientation and solution-focused work. That's what also our female participants said, what they really appreciated within the intervention. So in terms of content, we need to reframe help seeking, making clear that fighting back is not the solution. I think this is also relevant to survivors of all genders. Improve the health literacy, reducing self-stigma, using case examples and role models on how to do that, and drawing attention to the potential benefits of the treatment. And then information about where and how to access professional support. Next slide. And then this is the last slide. In terms of language design and content, we have to take male socialization into account, but I don't think we have a lot of research yet on what this actually means. I mean, a lot of apps out there are actually more made for men than for women, and others are not. And I think we really have to do a lot of research, like what we actually need here. But for sure, we need a gender-sensitive design and be sensitive to subgroup differences and barriers, motivations, social surroundings, and health priorities. And I think this is really relevant to men because, unfortunately, we can't tell them that they have so many support options out there as women have. So, that's something that we will need to deal with when we develop this digital intervention and adapt it also to the needs of male survivors. And if we still have time, I would be really curious to, next slide, yeah, hear your thoughts on this, and yeah, hear what you think might be necessary to meet the needs of male survivors with this intervention.